Deconstructed, Mental Health and Wellness with Dr. Kaz and George.
The statements of Dr. Kaz and George are not a substitute for medical care, and our opinions are our own. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please seek assistance from a professional in your area.
You can contact us via Twitter at MindDeconstruct. I'm your host, George. With me is Dr. Kaz. Dr. Kaz Nelson is an American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology certified psychiatrist, licensed to practice medicine in the state of Minnesota, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota Medical School. Today on our podcast, we hope this helps. So, Dr. Kaz, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, you know me, but certainly the podcast audience doesn't know me. I know George because he's been my brother for several years.
Whoop, whoop.
All of our years. But we grew up in Minnesota. Both of us have lived in Minnesota our whole life in terms of our hometown, and lived in different places in Minnesota, Twin Cities, Fergus Falls. We both went to college out on the prairie in Morris, Minnesota, and we love Minnesota and care about the people in this state.
And I'm George. I'm a former Marine and a liberal arts undergrad major. I do have an attorney license here in the state of Minnesota. I have practiced in the areas of commitments, child protection, and criminal law. So what are we doing here?
Well, we got a podcast going on.
Why?
Why are we doing a podcast? That's a good question. I think we're out at dinner with your friend, and he suggested we should do a podcast.
So here we are.
Seemed like a really good idea at the time.
Yeah.
$300 of equipment later, we're sitting in your basement and ready to roll here.
I'm pretty proud of my basement right now, but that's not why we're here.
No,
we're here
not.
because you're a psychiatrist and you've got some stuff on your mind, right?
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist at the University of Minnesota. I do a lot of teaching and I take care of a lot of people. And it seems like there's somebody missing out in that equation, and that's the public and the community. So the more we can educate not only people training in psychiatry, but also consumers of mental health care, or people who love people who are consumers of mental health care, or just anyone wondering what's the deal with psychiatry and mental health, this podcast is for you.
So you're a psychiatrist. What does that mean?
That's a fabulous question, because I run into a lot of people who don't really understand the term, or maybe have some confusion about what's a psychologist and what's a psychiatrist. Well, psychiatrists are medical doctors, meaning after college we've got 4 years of medical school, and then we select the specialty of psychiatry. So some people go into internal medicine, some people go into pediatrics. I studied for 4 additional years after medical school in psychiatry, and that qualifies me to be a practicing psychiatrist, which means I can prescribe meds and I can practice psychotherapy and do all the things that a medical doctor and some parts of what a psychologist can do as well.
So what is a psychologist then?
Psychologists have varying degrees of training based on what their licensure is and their credentials, but psychologists can do talking therapy, practice different modalities of psychotherapy, but in most states they're not able to prescribe medications, although that's changing in some states based on local laws.
What kind of meds is a psychiatrist going to be giving me? Can I get Vicodin from a psychiatrist?
Well, I guess technically our license would allow us to practice medicine and prescribe Vicodin, but for the most part, most psychiatrists I know are trained and comfortable prescribing mental health medications. And there's certainly a range of medications in that class, but that could be antidepressants, antipsychotic medications, mood stabilizers, anti-anxiety medications, things like that.
Are there specialties within psychiatry?
Yes, every now and then you do find a subspecialist in psychiatry who may be specialized in addiction psychiatry or geriatric psychiatry, pain. There's several subspecialties within psychiatry that you can go on to get additional training after your general training, and many do.
What about you?
I do not have any subspecialties after my general psychiatry training degree, but in my studying I have focused on a certain area of psychiatry, mood disorders, with particular interest in the disorder borderline personality disorder.
Okay, Dr. Kaz, if I were to go see a psychiatrist, how would I do that?
That's a great question, because depending on where you live, you may have access to psychiatry or you may not. I would say most people find that they could talk to their primary care provider to see what they would recommend. Is there a psychiatrist that's nearby? Is there somebody that they trust based on that psychiatrist's care of other patients? And would they be covered by your insurance, or is it something where they don't accept insurance? Those are all sort of the more important issues to navigate on the front end, which can be a problem if you're in the middle of experiencing a mental health crisis. It's a lot to navigate.
So how do I know if I need a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or who's going to make that decision for me, and how does that work?
If you're experiencing an emergency with your mental health, say you're feeling like you want to take your life or feel that you'd be better off dead, you want to access care in the way that really reflects that it's an emergency. So you're not just going to call a psychologist's office and try to get an appointment for 6 weeks. You're really dealing with something more urgent than that. So that might be a case where you actually go to the emergency room or the urgent care center as a foot in the door to the system. But say it's not that severe. Say you're experiencing symptoms that concern you, a change in your mood, unusual experiences that you're not sure how to make sense of that. You could start with a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and sometimes a primary care provider is a good person to help you sort that out. Most psychologists I know, if they feel like it's something where a medication might be useful, they'll recommend that you also follow up with a psychiatrist, and vice versa. Most psychiatrists will let you know if they feel like additional support through psychotherapy or treatment is warranted.
So where do you interact with most of your patients?
I am an inpatient psychiatrist, and so that means at the University of Minnesota, I work on an inpatient ward with people who have been hospitalized because their mental health symptoms have been so serious. That could be severe psychosis, where people have lost touch with reality and they are experiencing cognitive or perceptual issues related to their brain and behavior, or people who are experiencing suicide thoughts or very serious self-injury.
Is that pretty common that people need to be hospitalized based on a mental illness?
Most people experiencing mental illness do not need to be hospitalized, and hospitalization is really only pursued if there's an imminent threat at play. Unfortunately, that is the case in a percentage of people. Their symptoms are so severe that they're at danger of hurting themselves or others, or their illness has become so severe that they're not even able to provide safe, basic care for themselves. And those are the people that end up hospitalized. And we, of course, try to, with any hospitalization, make it as short as possible in order to treat what's going on urgently and then move people to a less intense level of care so they're able to continue in their journey in a least restrictive setting.
Is a portion of that cost-based? Like, are hospitals trying to get people out the door because it's expensive to have them in there?
Well, when we treat people in medicine, we do have to apply certain ethical principles. There's autonomy, beneficence. Without getting into too much detail, there is a principle of justice, meaning that it's a high level of care, it's an expensive level of care, and so we reserve it for people who really need it. If our hospital beds are full of people who don't need that care, that means that those in the emergency room who need that care sometimes have to take an ambulance to Fargo. And so cost has something to do with it, but I wouldn't say it's a money-making enterprise. It's a reality that it's an expensive and rare level of care that we provide.
And Fargo's a 4-hour drive from your hospital.
Absolutely, but it's not uncommon that people in the emergency room are put in an ambulance and sent to Duluth or Fargo or other states to receive urgent psychiatric care if our beds are full. And so we really need to be mindful of who's using those beds and make sure that it's the sickest of the sick. And if they could be treated by a less intense level of care, and then we try to do that.
Is Minnesota in need of more medical beds for mental health crises in persons?
Every state in the country is.
Okay.
It's a really serious problem.
But how do we get more mental health beds, get the people the help they need?
Well, that would begin with better outpatient care and better health insurance, better reimbursement for outpatient care, because we'd really love to prevent those inpatient hospitalizations. So the solution alone is not create more hospital beds, although that's a portion of the solution to address the crisis that we have right now. We want to enhance outpatient resources, but there are issues related to reimbursement and different cost structures and health insurance and all those kinds of things that make it usually a disincentive for hospitals to build mental health facilities. And so those that do exist are really doing a service to the community.
Do you have enough information up there that we can fill 10 episodes of a podcast?
That's not going to be a problem.
Okay.
I do a lot of teaching, interact with a lot of students, speak with a lot of people about these topics, and people are hungry for this information. And the more we can connect the community, your everyday person, with information that can destigmatize and also equip them to take care of their own mental health and the mental health of others, that's going to be a contribution to our society.
Mental health stigma is going down, isn't it?
I think so.
I have less of a problem with it personally.
I'm glad to know your stigma is coming along there, George. Everybody has biases and stigma against those who are mentally ill to varying degrees. And it's one of the biggest barriers to people actually accessing care is their self-stigma when they're struggling. There's a lot of self-judgments and judgments of others that go into this. And it comes from a long, long history, back as far as you can remember, when people with mental health symptoms were believed to have demonic possession, which was considered unfavorable at different parts in our history. And so, we've certainly come a long way from there, but we have more to go.
If I have a loved one that I think might be, severely depressed, and I've talked to him about it, other family members have brought it up, and that person says, no, I'm not depressed, or I'm just a little sad, or denies even having a problem, can I still help them in some way?
That's one of the hardest things for anybody to encounter. And I think all of us have been there to different degrees, struggling to know, how do I help? What do I say? What's my role? And it's going to be different for every person. But I would say not to sell yourself short in the power that you have in reaching out and helping another person. So I think a lot of times we're sort of scared to reach out or scared to talk to a person, scared that we might even make it worse or contribute to the stress they might be enduring. A good example of that is if you're worried that somebody might actually take their life. It's sort of a hard subject to talk about. It's awkward dinner table conversation. Hey, thinking of killing yourself today? It's not easy to work into a conversation. But we're trying to encourage people that if that really is a concern, our experience tells us that asking about it directly doesn't actually plant that idea or make suicide thoughts worse. It can actually help relieve those thoughts and open some very important doors. And so we should work on lowering whatever barriers exist to asking that question.
When is it bad enough that I should be calling the police or seeking a mental health hold or seeking a civil commitment? What's the bar that I need to know in order to kind of take that drastic step of maybe an involuntary type situation for that person?
Yeah, I would say that if you're struggling with that question, that you're certainly not alone. There's families across the nation, across the world, who really, really struggle with that line. But I would say that anytime there's any concern about safety, anytime it gets into a life or death question, you should not hesitate to call 911 and access emergency services, because that's one of the things that you would regret not having done if somebody gets hurt, either the person or somebody around them. And what discourages a lot of people is maybe you have called 911. Maybe you have called urgent services related to your county, and they come out and they say, not really enough of a concern, not really enough to bring somebody to the hospital. But calling repeatedly can actually change the situation. And so it may be that one call doesn't reach the level of concern where somebody's involuntarily hospitalized, but several calls might make the difference where the county or emergency personnel say this requires involuntary evaluation at the very least, and perhaps even a hospitalization. And then that hospital team is there with you to decide whether further involuntary treatment, like a mental health or a civil commitment, is necessary.
Getting them to the hospital obviously is a good thing, but there are going to be times where the doctor sends them home. Mm-hmm. And you're saying don't let that stop you from calling again if something else happens or if it gets more serious, because that pattern of maybe self-injurious type thought is gonna be part of the equation.
Exactly.
Okay. I mean, I'm assuming doctors are sending a lot of people home because it's not serious enough, right?
Yeah, the doctors in the emergency room or other triage related settings have a very difficult job. They're managing they're managing inpatient resources. They're managing the individual safety risks of any person and working hard not to violate anybody's individual rights. And none of us have a crystal ball. So we need as much information as we can in making that decision to do that calculus and decide whether we think that somebody's behavior represents an imminent risk or not. And so one way you can help is not holding back in directly stating any safety-related concerns you might have. They might listen to that and determine that it still doesn't meet the bar for inpatient hospitalization, but the hope would be in those cases they would recommend a less restrictive level of care, whether it's a partial hospitalization or a day treatment program or weekly therapy or a referral to a psychiatrist. And down the line, they may need to be brought back to the hospital again if further concerns persist.
Are we off topic now? Or is this what you want to talk about?
Well, what I wanted to get across today was basically we hope this podcast helps. So anything we can do to share information or resources to help navigate what are very difficult issues to navigate for any person, that's what we want to talk about. So I would say it's all on topic.
Is there anywhere online that people can go that you prefer? You know, people get some information from or resources. Like, do you like WebMD? Do you like the National Alliance of Mental Illness website? Who do you like people to get their information from?
For concerned family members, the National Alliance on Mental Illness has excellent resources. They even have local and state-specific resources. And so for concerned family members, I would have you start there because they can help you find even more specific resources. I also feel that other websites do a good job, like WebMD or Mayo has a nice website for information for consumers. But the difficult thing with those sorts of websites are when it comes to mental health, it's very difficult to diagnose oneself or another person in the same way that would be if you had a pimple or a rash and you could go on WebMD and say, oh, that rash looks a little bit like that rash. I maybe got into some poison ivy or something like that. With mental health, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so we encourage informed consumers, and there are online resources that can help with that. And we also suggest interacting with a professional to help you sort what through can be quite complicated.
In making diagnoses, psychiatrists have to rely on the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual? Is that right?
Well,
what is the DSM?
Yeah.
What does the DSM stand for?
Yeah, the DSM is our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's published by the American Psychiatric Association. And that's basically a book that's a consensus of leading psychiatrists across the country where they all put their heads together. And because we don't have lab tests or imaging studies to really cinch a diagnosis in psychiatry, we had to come up with lists of symptoms and in order to arrive at a diagnosis. And it's not perfect. Certainly the DSM has been changed over time. There's been diagnoses in there that have actually been taken out. For example, in the 70s and 80s in the DSM, there was actually a psychiatric diagnosis of homosexuality.
As a mental illness.
As a mental illness, correct. And certainly the field wised up and removed that as a psychiatric diagnosis as quickly as possible because it's not a psychiatric diagnosis. So it's kind of considered a living process where these diagnoses are honed over time with growing knowledge and research and expertise. So it's the best that we have right now as a field, but it's not perfect, and the criteria in there don't fit every single individual. And so it really takes some further understanding of an individual's perspective and where they come from, and then even collateral information. So sometimes, depending on the diagnosis, we need information from people who know the person well in order to be as accurate as possible. I would think of a condition like delusional disorder. By definition, doesn't have very good insight from the person experiencing it. So if somebody comes in and says, I worry that somebody's poisoning the salt in my salt shaker and I can't stop thinking about it. We sometimes struggle with knowing, well, is their salt shaker being poisoned or is this a delusion? And by definition, the person saying that is not going to say, well, it might be true, but it might not. They're saying, nope, that's for sure what's happening. And so sometimes we need to understand a little bit more about that person from their loved ones or people who know them to understand what's going on with that salt shaker.
Have you ever thwarted a poisoning?
Thwarted a poisoning. Gosh, there's certainly been some cases that I've interacted with from time to time where I scratched my head and said, I really don't know if this is true or not. For example, a common one that's very difficult is the belief that a spouse is cheating on someone.
So that could be part of a delusional disorder.
Or it could be true.
Or they could be getting gaslighted by their loved one.
Right.
Like, oh, let's bring you in for a checkup because you're crazy if you think I'm cheating on you.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
We're probably not going to unravel that mystery in an inpatient unit.
Well, something like that, unless there was an imminent risk, probably wouldn't reach the level of inpatient unit. It might be dealt with in the outpatient unit. But it requires some real close understanding of the issue from the person themselves and those around them. And sometimes we never really get to the bottom of it, but try to help somebody function and deal with their reality, whether it's true or not, and just help them to do better with what might be a difficult or stressful situation. And that's where a little bit the art of psychiatry comes in.
So art and science, is that kind of a thing? Do psychiatrists think of that?
Yeah, for better or for worse. Psychiatry is one of the younger fields of medicine. So I would say cardiology is fairly worked out. We understand the electrophysiology of the heart, the Purkinje fibers, the different electrical currents and ion exchange that takes place in the nerves of the heart. And
she went to med school.
Yes, I did. But we have some understanding of the brain and its behavior, but it's completely understood. And there's still a lot of art that goes into the practice of psychiatry, which makes it a bit of a creative field. So that's one reason you might work with a psychiatrist that you click with, and you might not, because everybody brings themselves into the equation to some degree.
Here's another question that I have. Psychotic?
Mm-hmm.
Who's psychotic?
So the term psychosis is a very broad term for a general set of symptoms. It's sort of like saying short of breath. It doesn't imply any specific diagnosis, more of a symptom that's going on. But very basically, psychosis means separation from reality.
So someone who's separated from reality is psychotic. And that could be the delusional disorder you talked about.
Yep.
But could that be other things?
Absolutely. There's several diagnoses that cause psychotic symptoms.
Is a psychotic person, by definition, a danger to themselves or others?
Nope. There are lots of people managing psychosis on a daily basis and functioning quite well.
So managing psychosis, are they actively psychotic? Are they actively
Sure.
separated from reality?
Yeah, somebody with a chronic schizophrenia might actually hear voices from a entity that doesn't exist in reality, but they have a perceptual issue where their brain is providing sounds or noises or words or phrases to them that they just deal with and do their job and play a role in their families and their community while they're experiencing these symptoms that do not have a basis in reality.
Okay, so the other one, you hear psychotic a lot. You also hear schizophrenic a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Are they separate things or kind of interplay?
Yeah, schizophrenia is one of the more common diagnoses that have psychotic symptoms associated with it. And certainly, we tend to use these phrases and words sort of casually. So I think there was even some political events in the recent weeks where a high visibility political figure was saying, "Oh, we think somebody is a paranoiac or a schizophrenic or something like that." And we're trying
you
to
can
be
use
more...
the word Trump.
I think it was actually the guy who was the communications director who then was fired or stepped down.
Oh, yeah, the Scaramucci.
Yes.
Yes. Paranoiac, is that a word?
No.
Okay, just checking.
So, well, it may technically be a word, but
It's not a psychiatric.
it's not a psychiatric diagnosis that we would qualify somebody. So, we want to be very careful with language and use it sensitively because there are people living with the illness of schizophrenia, and words matter. And so schizophrenia is a disorder that has psychosis with it, in the same way that congestive heart disease has shortness of breath, but shortness of breath is a broad set of symptoms.
So in the coming episodes, what sort of things do you want to talk about?
Well, my mission here really is to serve as a translator between the psychiatric community and the medical community and the general public. So if you're a neuroscientist or a psychiatrist and you're listening to this podcast, you might say, well, that's an oversimplification, or, I wouldn't quite put it that way. And that's completely fair because my intent is to simplify and help the public digest what can be very complex and nuanced ideas. And so I'm really going to work to achieve as much nuance as possible, but in some ways I might be using metaphors or simplifying things or using a little bit of hyperbole in order to communicate key concepts. So I just want everyone to be cool and bear with it. And if you have feedback for me or you want me to revisit a topic or add more nuance down the line, I'd be delighted to do that. But in the end, I'm trying to make this digestible to anybody who cares about these issues.
Okay, so one of the things that we've talked about doing is answering listener questions. And that's hopefully going to be a full segment of our program, is listener questions coming into our Twitter at MindDeconstruct. There's a DM, there's a direct message on Twitter too, like they can send it to us privately without blasting it to the whole Twitter world.
That's right.
And that's perfectly all right. We'll definitely take those. So send us your questions and we'll answer them to the best of our ability, of course. Yeah, any specific sort of areas of questions you want?
I'll take any kind of questions in the field of mental health, whether it's something that you're suffering with yourself or asking on behalf of the loved one or someone that you care about. We're here to help you understand yourself better and the world better and advance people's health and well-being.
I think we can handle that, can't we?
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah, I guess that's actually a pretty big bite of the apple there.
It's an important mission, but we're primed to take this on.
Yeah, let's try it. And we'll say it more than once. We're on Twitter at MindDeconstruct.
That's right. We love the Twitter.
Do we have a tweet out yet?
We don't.
By the time we publish this, we'll get a tweet out there.
All right. We love the Twitter, although we haven't done it yet, but it's coming.
Okay, good. Thank you for joining us today. This podcast was produced by Kaz and George. Music by Paul.
He's the best.
Contact us and send us your questions on Twitter at MindDeconstruct.